In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on optimizing healthy psychological functioning within certain self-care conducts. As one whom is engaging more appropriate self-care, allowance is the cultivation of healthy psychological functioning, optimizing one's subjective well-being within a domain-specific direction of desired meaningful effect, to mean that certain self-care conducts compared to other self-care conducts hold distinct meaningful transformations within distinct uniquely meaningful pathways within mind-body connections. The self conducts. As one conducts self-care appropriately to engage healthy psychological functioning compared to dysfunctions, and or the opposite direction within engaging self-harm to increase dysfunctions resulting from misconducts, not conducts, to mean that individuals who are engaging in healthy psychological functioning always are engaging in conducts, never misconducts, and are always engaging in more appropriate, not necessarily appropriate, yet more appropriate conducts, yet never inappropriate and or the often self-inflicted harms resulting from self-harm, as there is a gray area between what's appropriate and or misappropriate or inappropriate, to mean that inappropriate uniquely concerns invalid misconducts, not valid conducts that perhaps are irrelevant, to mean that it's not so much that the conducts are appropriate in the event certain conducts are irrelevant, yet it does not necessarily mean that the conducts are inappropriate, yet it may provide some benefit to treat the irrelevant conducts that hold no effect and or are less meaningful in terms of providing the intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies. Not that the conducts are counterproductive and or worsening the intracategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies to be inappropriate, yet are irrelevant, to mean that they tend to lack effects and or are often less optimal compared to the more appropriate conducts. Meaning that there are conducts that allowance for error and or exist irrelevant to what is more appropriate, not necessarily meaning that those conducts are misconducts to be inappropriate. Allowancing for one to, within the more appropriate conducts, engage more meaningfully healthy psychological functioning, in some cases self-care, optimizing one's subjective well-being, compared to still engaging what is within healthy psychological functioning irrelevant conducts, yet does not optimize healthy psychological functioning, and or in the case one is engaging in dysfunctions to not constitute healthy psychological functioning, is engaging in often self-harm derived from certain directly and or indirectly associated misconducts the self is conducting and or responsible for correcting, otherwise engaging in irresponsible misconducts, to be held responsible for being guilty for those misconducts and or is otherwise negligent for being irresponsible in engaging the misconducts resulting in certain dysfunctions, well defined as a must be good enough and necessarily necessary conditions, lacking the multifunctionalities held within healthy psychological conducts one expects and or existingly holds to engage causations optimizing one's subjective well-being instead of worsening one's subjective well-being, and or worse, inflicting the pathologies within experiences of ill well-being resulting in chronic disease and or illness and or unnecessary suffering and or psychological distress, often more likely to be elicited within experiences engaging the HPA axis involving the hippocampus, a region of the mesolimbic system named the hippocampus that is responsible for memory and or engaging in certain consolidations within learning and memory, meaningful for engaging optimized learning and or creative problem solving to consolidate the solutions and or reconsolidate the configurative sequencing for more meaningful future-oriented solutions as one's engaging the tried and true practical wisdom of the past to resolve certain stress-related and or other related problems, to infer certain causations within the satisfying of certain brainstormed conditional criteria. To meet the meaningful criterion one brainstorms, only certain criterion need to be met in order to resolve problems, yet one may and or the best problem solvers tend to brainstorm more possible probabilistic resolvable meaningful criterion to resolve certain issues within the conditional criteria one brainstorms, compared to individuals who tend to engage more reactive conducts, engaging less meaningful activation within the hippocampus, activating less meaningful memories in relation to the release of stress hormones involving epinephrine and or norepinephrine, also named, in the case of epinephrine, adrenaline, and or norepinephrine, noradrenaline, increasing the pupil dilations and the blood flow that increases the arousal for one to process more meaningfully information within more aware and or optimized thinking processes to resolve certain issues with the increased attentional awareness, with often a more refined acuity to isolate certain problems and or appropriately address those with the increase in psychological energy to fuel one's thinking, often accelerating the meaningful utterances of thought to draw from distinct regions of the brain, yet it's the HPA axis connecting the hippocampus to the pituitary gland within the mesolimbic area and the amygdala, which is in the center of the, well, it's more closer to the posterior region of the brain that is related to the hippocampus, connected to the amygdala, is processing meaningful negative and or positive emotions, influencing nearly all meaningful emotions and all the primary meaningful emotions, meaning that surprise, fear, anger, joy, love, excitement are all being engaged within the amygdala, including some more complex, meaningful emotions such as enthusiasm, more meaningful for creative problem solving, and or aesthetic absorptions connected more to curiosity and or surprise and or interest. Be it that interest is more complex and not always it is a basic meaningful emotion as a primary meaningful emotion within human beings, yet in terms of exploring differences within other species, interest tends to be less meaningful. It does not necessarily mean that animals do not experience absorption and or interest, yet the complexity and or need to engage in interest is less complex, and you see this reflected within the size of our brains and the amount of questions the average child will ask compared to the most intelligent adult who tends to ask the most questions compared to the average adult whom is more likely to ask slightly less questions than perhaps they would have done as a child. As children are always curious to engage learning and cultivating learning, and the most questions one will ask tends to be the areas in one's life one is more curious with exploring, engaging more complex, meaningful emotions associated with interest and or creative problem solving. Yet, as it pertains to distinctions within stress and or resolving stress meaningfully, we tend to engage creative problem solving with the regulations from the executive function within the orbital prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain that allowances for the regulation of the HPA axis to moderate the harmful overextending of certain stress hormones related to norepinephrine and or epinephrine, adrenaline and or noradrenaline, as well as various catecholamines and or cortisol that are stress hormones that allowance for more fuels to resolve complex problems and or tend to increase the intrinsic motivations throughout mind-body connections, not necessarily just within creative problem solving, to avoid and or resolve problems within the acuity to identify the issues and or solve those issues. For example, in some cases, you may have a stress response related to, say, a leak in a boat. And it's not that you're going to jump off the boat because you're concerned with drowning, and so you swim to shore. That may itself be, in some cases, counterproductive. You would approach the issue with higher acuity to fix the hole in the boat, not to avoid it, as to mean that you're engaging in future-oriented problem solving that is engaging the executive function to evaluate the risks and or benefits, future-oriented, appropriate to resolve and or moderate your HPA axis. Optimizing often future-oriented creative solutions to the stressors within the external environment you experience and or are more likely to, within experiences unique to the meaningful similarities, not necessarily the situations you think one may provide a solution you had used within a distinct stress experience to resolve the errors in another, yet as a must be good enough and necessary conditions hold the same meaningful similarities in terms of the meaningful similar problems and or the intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties to resolve the meaningful similarities within the solutions to the meaningful similarities within the problems. So the solutions are elaborated within the meaningful similarities, not arbitrary similarities, to mean that one thinks it's similar and meaningfully similar, yet is not meaningfully similar. This allowances for future-oriented optimizations of healthy psychological functioning, domain-specific to resolve difficult, complex problems. Allowancing for more meaningful, creative problem solving as it pertains to distinctions within self-care, engaging more exercises in terms of engaging the mind's muscle for brainstorming to allowance for more creative problem solving and or solution seeking is a meaningful and perhaps one of the most meaningful optimizing self-care conducts you may conduct on a daily basis, as you could brainstorm a wellness checklist each day and or constitute what your evaluation criteria looks like amongst the rank order evaluation schemas. So you could, within your wellness checklist, have an A, B, C priority checklist and or the desired and or needed wellness conducts you should engage in and or expect yourself to engage in with the highest priority set to A, meaning that this is something you need to conduct today and or complete today, compared to B, that is moderately meaningful to conduct today and or resolve, yet is less meaningful to resolve within the same day than the A priority, and or C, in terms of the best checklists, tend to be the bonus in terms of if you were to complete C within the day, you would be ahead tomorrow, meaning that you do not necessarily need to complete C within the day, yet in the event you complete C within the day, you are more likely to experience certain benefits the following day from the responsible conducts you had engaged within the day of your to-day list. You have brainstormed the wellness checklist with certain brainstorm evaluation schemas into the priority most meaningful to conduct those wellness practices. And this allowances for a meta approach to wellness, optimizing your wellness most meaningfully, as you're able to optimize your productivity across distinct domains to engage the distinct meaningful pathways within mind-body connections more meaningfully, organizing the complex organizations of the organized mess within your subjectivity to allowance for easier access and evaluation to complex sets of meaningful information as you're evaluating your approach to self-care, optimizing healthy psychological functioning. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep on doing the